Well, it's good to be with you again today. We have lots on our agenda, so let's go ahead and get organized. For our lesson, you'll want to have activity 4.1, that will be part of your assignment, and then activity 4.2 you can continue working on during the lesson today. On our agenda, we're going to start by finishing up information about the gross domestic product, actually starting and finishing it, then reviewing our previous section. We'll be talking about the wealth of nations and trade today, working on statistical highlights and some map work as well. Now, after we finish talking about gross domestic product, our main idea will be countries can be classified as developed, developing, or underdeveloped. Trade is a key ingredient for economic prosperity, but it also leads to conflict. Your goals for our new section today are to distinguish between a developed and a developing country, identify division of labor as the best evidence of a nation's development, identify biblical principles that encourage prosperity, identify the main purpose of trade and the causes of trade disputes, and define imports and exports. All right, let's go ahead and get started today with our chapter verse. Hope you have this about learned. This is our last section, Genesis 1:27 and 28. Go ahead and read along with me. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. All right, we are going to cover some of the information that was planned for the last lesson, particularly the ideas of gross domestic product and gross GDP per capita. So we're talking about ways that nations measure wealth. First of all, we need to define wealth. What is wealth? Well, when you think of wealth, do you think of big houses and big fancy cars and lots of jewelry? Most people do think of wealth as ownership of things. But the better definition economically is the ability to produce new things. Now, the most common way to measure the wealth of nations is by the GDP of the nation. And that stands for, again, the gross domestic product. By gross, we don't mean like, ooh, disgusting, but we mean gross total. Domestic stands for home, and product is a good or a service, goods or services. And it includes the value of all goods and services produced for sale within a country in 1 year. Okay, now sometimes you might see the term GNP, gross national product. It's the same thing, gross national or domestic product. However, the GDP alone isn't very helpful. For example, say two countries have the same gross domestic product. They produce a lot and have maybe they produce $2 million worth or $2 billion worth, but one country has 5 times as many people as the other country. The one with the greater population would actually be a poorer nation. Think of it in terms of a family. My father is the oldest of 12 children, and say that his father made, let's just pick a number, it was a long time ago, so I'll pick a low number, 20,000, well, that's probably not even low for then. Let's say he made $10,000 a year back then, way back then. And there was another family whose father made $10,000 a year back then, and he only had one child. Which family is going to be really the richer, as far as material things, family, the wealthier family? It's the one that can produce the $10,000 a year because they're not going to spend as much of it. Okay, do you see? And a family with 12 children is going to be a poorer family because they're going to spend up what they're producing. Okay, so that's just kind of, it's not totally parallel, it's not a totally parallel analogy, but that gives you an idea that the population of the country needs to be figured in. So, The statisticians, of course, leave it to them, figured up another calculation, and it is the per capita GDP. And this shows us the nation's wealth compared to the population. The per capita GDP, that means per person gross domestic product. This is the average value of products made by each person in the country, and it reflects each worker's productivity on average. So if we saw a number that says, the United States is 27,000 something, that doesn't mean that every worker is earning that much money. That's just an average. Now, if you look at page 80, here is a little chart that shows a country, Bangladesh and Luxembourg, their population, their GDP, and their per capita GDP. Now, here you can see the example. It looks like Bangladesh makes a lot more money. Their gross domestic product is a lot more than Luxembourg. However, look how much greater the population is. So the money, this amount of money, even though it's greater than the amount that Luxembourg has, it has to be divided among, or it has this many people making the money. So a lot more people are working to make this money. So if you divide it and find an average for every person, look at the difference. It's a huge difference. This was the idea of the family. One family can make more than the other, but if they have a lot more kids, their per capita income is going to be lower. Bangladesh, $1,130 a year. That's not very much compared to United States standards. In Luxembourg, $24,800 per person a year on the average. So it's a much more wealthy nation. You can see how per capita is a better way to compare. Now, what you would do is just take the GDP, divide it by the population to get the per capita. It's not going to work out exactly even. I think they've rounded off these figures here, but you'll see that it comes out very close when you do that division. So that way you know how to calculate per capita GDP if you need to do so. Okay, now you also need to keep in mind that not all transactions are made in cash, and that's what's reflected here in these charts. Not all the food is purchased at a store, for example, where people grow their own food in their own gardens. That's not included in the statistics. So when we look at Bangladesh, we think, man, the people there must not have any money to buy themselves food. We have to remember that the economies are different in other countries, so perhaps the food's not as expensive. Also, many of those people might grow their own food, and that would not be considered in the GDP statistics. So people in some of these poorer countries, many are having very great difficulties and great poverty, but others, many of them are able to get what they need to survive. But it's certainly no comparison to the United States and the material goods that we have here, and that's probably one reason that many people are so wrapped up in materialism. But we do want to take a moment to practice calculating GDP. So I'm going to let you practice with your family. We're just going to assign them some income, all right? So I just kind of pick these numbers, assign these earnings to calculate your family gross domestic product. Okay, grandfather or grandmother, you might have all four still living, or you might have just one or two. Total them up. They're going to get $75,000 a year. Woo, wealthy grandparents. Mother or father, let's give them $50,000 a year. So that's going to be $50,000 for your mother, $50,000 for your father. Okay? Brother or sister, for each brother, $30,000. For each sister, $30,000. And you're part of your family, right? So I'll give you $23,000. And then for your aunt or uncle, however many aunts or uncles you have, just multiply that by 40,000. And for cousins, 25,000. And I'm still a fairly new aunt, so I cherish my little nephew, so they're going to be worth $37,000. He makes $37,000 a year. That's pretty good for a 14-month-old. Okay? Now, you want to add up your total and divide by the population, which is going to be the number of family members that you included, right? So go ahead and take time to do that. Calculate your family's GDP and per capita GDP. Okay, hopefully you got your calculations done there. I'm going to show you a sample. This is just my scratch work, so it's not especially neat, but here's where I added up, grandparents, parents, and so on. And then I multiplied, for each group. I have a lot of aunts and uncles, my dad being the oldest of 12, and a lot of cousins. So when I added it all up, our gross was 2,250,000. That's our gross. Then I divided it by the number of family members, 67, to come up with this. I rounded it off. 33,582 ended up being our per capita gross domestic product. So you're just adding up everyone's money that we assigned them and then dividing it by the number of family members that you used. So that gives you a little bit of practice calculating GDP and per capita GDP, which was one of our goals for that section. Now let's review and see what you remember. This is a little puzzle, and I'll give you a clue, and you try to determine what the word is, and then we have a word that will be spelled out in the box going down the center. Okay, first clue, economy which combines elements of capitalism and socialism. That is a mixed economy. Second clue, an economy in which the businesses freely compete. Okay, freely is your key there, free market. Third clue, leaders who start businesses. This is that big word that looks kind of funny. Entrepreneurs. Just remember a bunch of E's in there and one little U. You can probably get the consonants easily enough. Okay, the fourth one is a common measure of the wealth of nations. Gross domestic product, which we were just discussing. Number 5, money to build industries. That is known as capital. And number 6, economy in which government determines where industries are built and what they produce. Notice it's 2 words. That is a command economy. 7th one, workers in an industry. They are the labor. Number 8, a more meaningful measure of the wealth of nations. That is per capita GDP. Number 9, an economic system in which government owns major industries. Okay, that is socialism, which goes along with a command economy. And then our last one, an extreme form of socialism. And that is communism. And the last clue is an economic system in which private citizens own the major industries. That's an easy one because it's right there for you in our little box going straight down. Capitalism, and that's a term that you definitely want to remember. Now that we have learned the definition of wealth, it's not just what you own, but it's the ability to produce new products. We want to move on to how wealth is distributed among the nations. We know what wealth is, we know how it's measured. How is it distributed, though, among the nations? Now, socialists believe there's like a limited amount of money, and they have to divvy it all up between everyone, or among everyone, I should say. Remember the example of the quiz where we took points and gave extra points to people who didn't score as well, and that's their belief system. But capitalists believe that you can keep producing more and more wealth. Think of the goose that laid the golden egg. The socialists would probably take the goose, take the egg, kill the goose, cut it up and divvy it up to everybody, cut the egg up, and everybody gets a little piece of gold and that's it. But a capitalist says, hey, let's feed the goose and let it keep producing more and more wealth. That's the idea there. And the scripture tells us that rather than playing Robin Hood like socialism likes to do, let's take from the rich and give to the poor, that everybody should provide for their own family. 1 Timothy 5:8, but if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So we know that according to Scripture, it's not the government's job to provide for us, but each individual is to provide for his own household. And you might think, well, what about those who can't provide? That is the responsibility of Christians. In James 1:27, we read, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless, so that would be orphans, and the widows in their affliction. We're to take care of those people and to keep himself unspotted from the world. So we need to keep this in mind. It's not the government's responsibility to provide for us. We need to provide for our own households, and when the Lord blesses us, and even sometimes when we're not blessed financially, we might have to sacrifice, we need to look out for the interests of others. Now, the socialist country then believes that, hey, the government has to take care of everyone. And we kind of see that tendency in the United States that, hey, what's in it for me? What's the government going to do for me? But we need to remember that capitalist countries see that the wealth is not limited, like, oh, the government has to take it and divvy it out to everybody. But the wealth is an unlimited resource, and they can produce more and more wealth for those around them. And wealth, we want to talk about countries categorized by their wealth. And that is, the term we use for this is development. Development is the effective use of raw materials, labor, and capital. So think about this. Which is more valuable, raw materials or finished products? What would you pay more for? Is a man going to go pay thousands of dollars for a big lump of steel and a piece of fabric and some rubber and some glass? No, he's not going to pay that much for the raw products. The final product costs more because you have to have machinery to make that final product. You have to pay the laborers who work on that final product. So the final product is worth more than the raw materials it contains. And the statisticians and economists, of course, have come up with a term for this to determine how much value has been added to the raw materials. And it's pretty simple, value added. It's nice of them to think of something easy enough for me to remember. And this is the value that manufacturers add to raw material or materials. All you do is subtract value of the final product from value of the raw materials. So if somebody pays $5 for the raw materials, they sell the object, whatever it is, their final product for $25, they've added $20 of value to the raw materials. Now, which countries do you think are going to be the most powerful countries? Those who make the most use of their raw materials, their labor, and their capital. And remember, that was our definition of development, wasn't it? And that's why we refer to these wealthy countries as developed countries. Developed countries generally have a wide range of industries. They use the people's skills fully. That's one of our parts of the definition of development. And most of the citizens benefit financially. Most of their citizens are going to be have more financial resources than citizens of other countries. Now, the benefit of the citizens is reflected in what figure? What do you think that we've talked about? Per capita GDP, isn't it? And the most developed countries are known as G7. This is another easy little abbreviation. It simply stands for Group of 7, and these are the 7 most developed countries in the world. These 7 countries produce over 3/4 of all value added by manufacture, and they include the United States, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Canada. And the G7 leaders meet every year to talk about economic and political problems. And what we want to do is look at some charts from your text that reflect how these nations came to be a part of G7. I mean, who said, okay, these are the ones that are going to be G7 and these are the ones that aren't. These are the countries that are developed and these are the countries that aren't. Well, it's based on GDP and per capita GDP. So you have a chart on page 80, which we're going to be referring to, and then you also have this chart on page 81 that we'll be referring to as well. So we're using both of these charts to answer a few questions, okay? Which nations appear on both charts? Okay, on this chart we have the United States, Canada, and Japan. Those three also appear, United States, Canada, and Japan. Those are the only three that appear on both charts with the highest per capita GDP and the highest GDP. Okay? Now, where does the United States appear on both charts? Where does Japan appear on both charts? And why is there a difference? Okay, let's look at this. The United States is first with the highest GDP. It's also first with the highest GDP per capita. Japan is third. It has the third highest. It makes the third most money in billions of dollars, $2,679 billion. However, look at their per capita, 21,300. We have a lot of countries in between there. So what that shows us is that several countries have a higher per capita GDP than Japan. Their average citizens earn more than the average citizens in Japan, but those countries don't make a higher GDP. Japan's total production is still greater than theirs, so that explains the difference. Okay? Now, which G7 nation has the lowest total GDP? What non-G7 countries appear before Canada in the list, and why does it belong? So the question kind of gives you a little bit of your answer. Here's Canada at the bottom. It does have the asterisk indicating it is a G7 country, but look, it only makes $694 billion each year, and all these other countries are ahead of it. But look at the per capita. It's compatible to the United States, Japan, and the other G7 countries. So remember, that is our important statistic in order to compare the wealth of nations. All right, now, the best measure of a nation's development is actually their division of labor. And division of labor yields job specialization and also increases production. Back in the 1700s, there was a Scottish economist named Adam Smith, and he wrote a book entitled The Wealth of Nations, and in it he gives an example of division of labor. He talks about a pen factory, little stick pens being made, where 10 men, if all they did was work on one pen, that one man made the entire pen, they could maybe make a dozen pens in a day. But with each of them having a special job, one draws the wire out, one cuts it off, one sharpens the edge, one puts the head on, and so on. They had it divided up into about 18 different jobs. They were able to produce about 4,200 pens. So we can see they each have a special task that they learn about, and then their production is greatly increased. Now, developed nations have a high level of division of labor, and workers can choose from thousands of specialized jobs rather than being limited mostly to agriculture as are workers in less developed countries. For example, look at page 81, and there's a chart here. Bangladesh, most of their people work in agriculture, very few in industrial labor and very few in service labor as compared to Luxembourg. These are the two countries we just looked at, their figures, and they only have 3% in agriculture and 65% in service labor. So those people are going to have much more choice, and they can specialize in a particular task. Now, nations that are not considered developed are referred to as developing or underdeveloped. Underdeveloped nations have a high GDP but a low per capita GDP, and people's skills are not used to the fullest. Underdeveloped nations are also known as least developed, third world nations, pre-industrial lands, and modernizing states. And their per capita GDP is usually about $2,000 or less. And in your textbook on page 81, there is a map that shows you the peach are the developed countries, G7, Russia's an unofficial member. Green are the developing countries. Blue are the least developed. Notice where the least developed falls near the equator. The most developed falls in the middle latitudes, both in the northern and southern hemispheres. And so there's a pattern there that shows us that climate does have an impact on economic production and on civilizations. Now, not all agricultural countries are developing countries. For example, New Zealand, many of the people there work in agriculture, but they are also a developed country. Bangladesh doesn't have a lack of skilled workers. They have a lack of skilled workers. They have plenty of workers, but not many that are skilled, and there are many of them working in agriculture. This doesn't necessarily mean that people are lazy, but in some countries, people don't really want to change. They put forth a lot of effort, but they don't necessarily want to learn a new method. And I think a good example of this is a little fly. You ever see them? They keep running their heads against the window trying to get out of the car or the house, and they're putting forth all the effort they can. They're not being lazy, but they just need to figure out another way to get out because they're not getting anywhere with the effort they're putting in. So that happens sometimes in the underdeveloped or least developed countries, that people want to stick with their old ways that they're familiar with. Now, it's not easy to tell what makes a country wealthy and what makes a country poor, but there are some scriptural principles about prosperity. We read in Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. However, we need to remember that material things pass away. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Matthew 6:20. Now, we've already learned that God does intend for man to work. That was from the beginning. It's not a part of the curse, although work did get more difficult with the curse. And that God wants man to be diligent. We looked at different verses that show us that. But we also know that the material is just temporary. God wants us, most importantly, to lay up treasures in heaven. And that's something that we want to keep in mind as we work. That, yes, God does bless the righteous. Sometimes we see that the wicked also prosper, but that's not the end of things. God is going to judge everyone in the end, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as we're working, to do our best, but for the Lord's sake, not just to gain material wealth. Now, we do still need to cover trade, so that'll be our last topic. We'll do that in our next lesson before we review and look at your test. Don't forget that you can break those lessons up, have your review one day, and take your test another day so that you're not overwhelmed. Now, let's quickly look at your assignment for today. There are several things that you need to be finishing up on. You want to go ahead and read pages 80 to 84. I'll let you skip the section review and do the chapter review instead, page 85. You're going to want to go ahead and finish activity 4.1. You should have numbers 3, 4, 6, and 7 left. And then, of course, you should have completed activity 4.2 today during the lesson. Where in the world? Where can you find the highest wind speeds ever officially recorded? Mount Washington, New Hampshire, where gusts have reached 230 miles per hour. And your new question? What country owns the world's largest island? See if you can find the answer to that before we meet together again next time.